Hi, and welcome to the Literary Lamppost podcast, where we analyse books and see what we can learn from them.
I'm Caitlin, I'm a math grad student, but I love English and I love analysing literature.
And I'm Ashley, an assistant editor for a magazine and a writer.
I am super excited for today's episode.
Me too.
Because we're doing one of my favourite books. I feel like I say that about every single book that we do.
It's not our fault that we're doing all of our favourite books.
This is true, we are doing all of our favourite books. Anyway, this book is The Help. It was published in 2009 by Catherine Stockett, and she actually drew a lot of what was in this book from her own childhood, much like Sue Monk Kidd did with The Secret Life of Bees. And many of the themes are overlapping. Rosaline in The Secret Life of Bees is essentially the same type of figure as Aibileen and Minnie in The Help. But in The Help, we go more into their stories and what it's like to be in their shoes compared to The Secret Life of Bees. I actually watched the movie a long time before reading the book, and I loved it. And then I discovered the audiobook, which was narrated by, among several others, the actress who plays Minnie, Octavia Spencer. And it's just so well done. I absolutely love it.
Yeah, I love the movie too, but it doesn't really do the book justice. And there's quite a lot of controversy hanging around the movie and the book and some complex issues. And so we're going to kind of get into that today.
So in this episode, we are going to be discussing the power of storytelling, some of the controversy around The Help, being one of the good ones, and intersectionality and the eroding of barriers between different people.
So the novel is set in Jackson, Mississippi in the early 1960s during the rise of the civil rights movement and the ongoing Jim Crow era racial segregation. The story is told from the perspective of three central female narrators. We have Aibileen Clark and Minnie Jackson, who are both black maids, and Eugenia, or Skeeter, Phelan, who is a young, white, aspiring writer who comes from a wealthy family.
Aibileen works for the Leafault family, and she has a very strong attachment to and connection with the Leafault's neglected toddler, May Mobley. And she works really hard to try and instill self-worth and equality into May Mobley. She has her repeat that she is kind and that she is smart and that she is important because she feels like she doesn't get this from her own parents.
And then there's Minnie, who's Aibileen's outspoken friend. She's constantly in trouble with her employers due to her candor. I don't use the word candor.
Sass-mouthing.
Due to her sass-mouthing and talking back. And she also faces a lot of domestic abuse from her husband, and she eventually finds safer work with Celia Foote, who we will come back to later.
Skeeter has recently graduated college and come back to Jackson, Mississippi, and is determined to be a writer. And when she comes back, she discovers that the maid who worked for her family, Constantine, who she was very close to growing up, has disappeared, and her family won't tell her what's happened.
Through that, Skeeter begins to be disturbed by the everyday racism around her, and she has this idea. She teams up with Aibileen and later Minnie and some other maids to secretly compile these testimonies, these stories of what it's like to be a black maid working for a white household, what it's like to raise white children while their own children are at home, being looked after by someone else.
And this book, which they get published anonymously, exposes the massive injustices faced by black maids and brings a lot of public attention to this issue, and it also draws a fair bit of outrage in the community. The project causes a lot of personal turmoil for these three main characters and some of the other maids who contributed to the writing of this book, The Help. But they all find this new hope in this sense of that they've done something really important with this writing. Overall, this book discusses race relations, friendship, courage, female solidarity, and it challenges some of those Southern social norms during this time period, and it explores the risks and consequences faced by those who speak up. So we've talked about language before, how language enables people to share their experiences. We did a lot on this in our episode on the Dictionary of Lost Words. But what we haven't focused quite as much on is the actual act of storytelling.
Storytelling is super powerful, and it's much easier to engage with something as a story compared to just a list of facts.
I am going to once again repeat what our fabulous English teacher, Miss Wright, used to say. Reading is mental practice for empathizing with the people in the real world. And Miss Wright, if you are listening to this, I just want to thank you so much for that quote. I have never forgotten it, and I don't think I ever will. I think that this quote it gets down to the core of why reading is so important and why engaging with stories in general is super important.
And in The Help, we see the way that telling stories was able to break down the barriers between the characters. Skeeter and Aibileen.
Once Aibileen starts telling her stories to Skeeter, and once Skeeter actually starts listening without embodying the superiority that came with being white at the time, and letting Aibileen tell all of the truth, including the things that would have been uncomfortable for her to hear, not shying away from the bad things she had to say, the barriers between Skeeter and Aibileen started eroding, and a real friendship formed between them, which was incredibly rare for the time.
A similar thing happened with Minnie and her employer, Celia. Once Celia started telling Minnie some of the personal things in her life, and vice versa, more of the barriers broke down between them.
So we see this empathy that was cultivated through this storytelling between these women, and it made a real difference in the social fabric of this time and place.
They started seeing each other as human beings and realized that the lines between them were just made up.
So I think that this book itself is an example of storytelling making an impact. It tells the story of a interesting societal dynamic that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. This book is really one of the few resources that I've encountered that tells the story of these black maids in the South. I didn't really know that that was a thing until reading this book. It's not something that you learn in school.
So this book did a lot of good things, but there are some things worth pointing out about the story as a whole, as well as the movie adaptation, which probably more of you are familiar with than the book, so we're going to talk about that for a little bit.
So there was a fair bit of controversy when this movie came out in 2011, which was 2 years after the book was published. It's classed as a drama/comedy, which I really don't think it should be.
It's kind of strange that it is.
The book it's got its funny moments, but I wouldn't be labeling it as a comedy, and I feel like that undercuts some of the important parts of the book. There's some great acting, some really beautiful, poignant moments, and some really deep pain and thoughtfulness, but overall I think the movie glosses over what I think might be the most deep and painful parts of what being black in the segregated South would have been like.
Yeah, I agree. And Viola Davis, the actress who plays Aibileen, has actually said that the movie ultimately didn't allow the voices of the maids to be heard.
You know, it kind of took me a little while to understand what she meant, because at first I'm like, well, what do you mean? The whole movie's about the maids. It actually took watching the movie and then immediately reading the book back to back to get what she's saying.
In the movie, Skeeter is the main voice. She's also the main writer on the book that they're working on. Aibileen is kind of a secondary character. In the book, Aibileen's one of the 3 protagonists and a co-editor of the book that they write. And the movie really diminishes her role in the story.
It takes away the impact that she herself is actually able to make as a black woman in this community, and really focuses on Skeeter as being this person who comes in and essentially saves this community and allows them to have this voice. I kind of said this earlier, but I think that the movie skips over some of the more painful and violent and confronting details about what the maids dealt with.
Things that were in the book, but
things
then
that
are
were in
just
the book
skipped in the movie.
And I think that that might have been done for the comfort of the audience, and I don't actually agree with that. I think that the movie would have done well to fully encompass what the book was trying to do. And to the actress's credit, it must have actually been really hard having to play that role as a black woman in today's society, you know, still facing racial challenges, but having all this progress made since then, having to put yourself back into that historical role, feeling what that must have been like. That must have been really hard.
It's valid, though. Her thoughts are valid.
They definitely are. And I think that it would be irresponsible to ignore that when we're thinking about the movie of The Help.
On the other hand, Octavia Spencer, who plays Minnie and is a very well-known actress, is actually positive about the film, and she's very supportive of it. She says that it honors the women who worked in these roles and what life was like for them. So I think, you know, both of the voices of these actresses are valid. They both have good points.
I think it's important that we listen and take on the feedback that's given on this movie and recognize that a movie can be fun and thought-provoking and we can still watch it, but recognize that it has some problematic elements. For me, watching the movie made me then go and read the book.
I think that the movie is a good place to start to engage with this story, but it's not a good place to stop.
And the book, I wouldn't say is problematic, but I do think it had some flaws. So there's this idea that we touched on a little bit earlier of white saviorism. And that concept of white saviorism is really only something that has entered the vocabulary in regard to telling stories in maybe the last 10 years or so. I mean, it's possible that it existed before, but I don't remember this awareness of it before that.
Well, even the fact that Catherine Stockett could write this book was a bit of a telling that it wasn't.
Yeah. And so it's this idea that these kind of stories where a white person comes into a non-white community and basically saves the day. And it's a valid critique of this issue. And I think that stories that have this element, they do disempower those communities and imply that they can't save themselves, that they're inferior, all of that. I think there's a little bit of truth to that.
This is one of those times where we have to hold two truths at the same time. And this is actually something that we've talked about in previous episodes and have really started to embody in a lot of our conversations and how we engage with media and that.
It's a really useful way of thinking when you find yourself in between these two sides of an argument. You can say, well, actually, two things can be true at the same time. And it's not necessarily, it's not the same as a middle of the road solution, but it's more acknowledging that issues are complex. Anyway.
So in The Help, the things that are true at the same time, number one, stories that consistently focus on a white savior to come and save Black or Indigenous communities send the message that those communities don't have agency, right? That they actually need someone who is white to be able to tell their stories, that they can't tell their stories themselves.
On the other hand, people who have privilege and the means to help others should do that and should help the people that don't. And it's a good thing when people who have the power to make changes use that for good. So those two things are both true at the same time. So when we approach stories that I guess you could say engage in white saviorism, we can just take that on and think about it in that way of, two things can be true at the same time.
I kind of think of the author a bit like Skeeter. She was a white woman who lived in Mississippi and was raised by a Black maid, and she wanted to tell their stories. That's a good thing that she wanted to tell their stories.
And she accomplished some really good things with this book. She told a story that wouldn't really be known in any other way and explained what it was like in the Deep South. And again, I didn't learn any of this in history classes. I learned about this dynamic of, Black women being maids through this book of The Help.
I guess the question is, the author is a white woman, so does she have a right to tell Black stories, like Skeeter in the book? Because really, it should be Black people telling their own stories, using their own voice, not having their stories told for them.
On the other hand, she had the voice to do so. She's an author and she decided to shine the light on something, and that was a good thing. Those who do have a voice should use it for good. And I do think that Stockett did that. And I think that she recognizes in a way that this is an issue with her writing. Minnie speaks of Skeeter writing about their issues, saying, I want things to be better for the kids, but it's a sorry fact that it's a white woman doing this.
She also writes about her own maid in the back of the book, saying, I don't presume to think that I know what it really felt like to be a Black woman in Mississippi, especially in the 1960s. I don't think it is something any white woman on the other end of a Black woman's paycheck could ever truly understand. But trying to understand is vital to our humanity.
I think what Viola Davis might be reacting to in the film, and is valid for the book overall as well, is that a white woman who hasn't experienced racism herself can't authentically get inside of the head of a person who has experienced that kind of systemic racism and segregation. And being constantly told that you're diseased and not worth as much as white people, not as smart as them, all of that, and that deep simmering anger and hurt that would come from this. I think that you can definitely write from a place of empathy, but you won't truly be able to capture it the same way a person who has been through that would be able to.
It's kind of like women who grow up in a patriarchal society, a man wouldn't be able to fully capture that, wouldn't be able to fully understand what it is like to be a woman, despite, being able to do a decent job.
So I think that while it's a valuable book and it does a good job for what it is, at the end of the day, it's told from empathy and not experience, and that does make a difference. But, what's memorable for me from this book is the courage of the maids to speak up.
It may not be perfect and it might have its issues, but it does make an impact. It makes you feel something, and it teaches you about a lot. It's also accessible to people. Someone who may not read the works of Malcolm X or Maya Angelou might watch or read The Help because it's presented in less of an activist way. Reading it or watching it is kind of this gateway to understanding what life was like, and it's a good place to start. Again, not a good place to necessarily stop.
And I think that what helps is going back to the idea of good storytelling and the importance of storytelling. It's presented as a story. And I think that stories are accessible to people in a way that political writing or philosophy just isn't.
So going back to Stockett's life herself, I think it's actually really interesting that Skeeter in the book is representative of the author. Stockett grew up in Mississippi with a black maid and then moved to New York when she was 24. I think Skeeter in the book moved to New York when she was like 25 or something. Stockett's maid died when she was 16, but in her little memoir at the back of the book, she writes with regret, and her memoir is actually titled Too Little, Too Late. And while she loved her maid, she says she never thought to ask herself how her maid would have felt working for a white family. Skeeter actually thinks in the book, wasn't that the point of the book? For women to realize we are just two people. Not that much separates us. Not nearly as much as I'd thought. And for Stockett, this is what the point of her book, The Help, was. She says, no one in my family ever asked Dimitri, her maid, what it felt like to be black in Mississippi working for our white family. It never occurred to us to ask. It was everyday life. It wasn't something people felt compelled to examine.
So writing The Help was Stockett's way to come back full circle and maybe deal with some of that regret. It's kind of like her eyes were opened when she left Mississippi, and she, like Skeeter, simply wanted to show the point of view of the people she had never bothered to ask growing up. So especially in the movie though, but to some extent in the book, there is this sense of you as the watcher identifying with Skeeter compared to the other white characters. And that's to be expected because, she's the protagonist, the main character.
One of Skeeter's best friends is named Hilly, and
she's the queen bee.
Yeah, she's the queen bee. She is the president of the Women's League in Jackson. She's the most popular girl in town, and she drafted an initiative to make sure that all households had a bathroom for the maid to use, which was their own bathroom, because black people carry different diseases than white people.
Yeah. So it's really easy to see Hilly's racism. It's super obvious that she's the antagonist. And I think that when we're presented with such an obvious dichotomy between good and bad, Skeeter and Hilly, it's easy for us to identify with the good side. And it makes people watching or reading the story, makes them look back at this time in history and think, oh, I'd be one of the good ones back then, like Skeeter.
Hilly is very clearly racist. Like, we can see that now. But at the time, her racism would have been cloaked to those around her. Like, Hilly knows what racism is. She knows it's bad. But she doesn't see the things that she does as racist. She covers her actions with phrases like, she's being a Christian and protecting our children. Like with the bathroom controversy, she uses fear to motivate her racist behavior. The separate toilets was under the guise of health.
She called it the Home Help Sanitation Initiative.
Yeah. And, it wasn't just people here and there who were racist, but it was systemic. It was built into what was considered normal. Hilly hides her racism under her words, her quote-unquote good intentions, and people often hide behind their good intentions, claiming that they care about issues when really what's hidden beneath that is racism.
Or discrimination in general.
Yeah. Protect our children is used as an excuse.
That's a really insidious one because it immediately taps into people's instincts to protect their children and it creates this emotional response. And it hijacks that response for, in this case, what Hilly wants. Be really careful when people are justifying things in the name of protecting the children. It's been around for a long time, but we still hear it today a lot. This phrase has been around for a really long time and used to justify all sorts of things, and it's still being used today.
You know, Hilly also has a conversation with Elizabeth about there being real racists in this town who would hurt Skeeter for questioning the Jim Crow laws. Hilly knows racism is bad, she just doesn't consider herself racist. And I think we see that so often today with, you know, people saying things like, I'm not racist, but, you know, da-da-da-da-da.
It's so easy for racism to grow even while you proudly proclaim that you're not racist. We touched on this a little bit in our last episode. I think it's a super common thing. Everybody knows racism is bad. Nobody wants to be thought of as racist, but we all need to acknowledge the potential for racism in ourselves. It's an unstable equilibrium, if you will, for those math nerds out there who know what that means. I think that the best way to avoid becoming or being racist is actually to recognize the potential within yourself for racism and actively fight and counteract it when those weeds pop up in your mind and heart.
Hilly is a more extreme, obvious version of racism, but racism can be very subtle and it can happen even in those who know racism is wrong. So I guess the question is, what does racism look like when it's more subtle? We live in Australia, so the issues facing Australia are going to be very different than, you know, Jackson, Mississippi in the 1960s.
But racism today can look like questioning if people of colour actually deserve the positions they have or if they've only gotten it through affirmative action. That's actually a misunderstanding of how affirmative action works. Affirmative action makes sure that qualified people aren't overlooked because of their demographic. It in no way means that unqualified people are getting positions instead of qualified people.
And it in no way means that when you get on a plane and see that your pilot is black, that you should assume that he's less qualified.
Because all pilots have to go through the same training in order to get the positions that they have. The help is set against the backdrop of the civil rights movement. That movement was monumental to getting the equality and integration in the USA and has had repercussions around the world. There have been voices that have said that passing the Civil Rights Act was a mistake, that Martin Luther King Jr. was awful, and that we need to go back to the time before that happened. And they'll justify it through a variety of ways. But at the end of the day, without the Civil Rights Act being passed and similar laws in Australia and other countries, we might still be back there in a place where black people were forced to use different coloured bathrooms and were beat up for using the white bathroom. We don't want to go back there. Racism today can also look like making and laughing racist jokes. And yeah, you could defend it by calling it dark or gallows humour, and that's usually the most common cop-out from what I've seen. But the whole point of gallows humour, which is what dark humour is, it's the proper name for dark humour, is that it's humour that you say when you're on the gallows. If you're not on the gallows and you're making jokes about the person on the gallows, you're part of the executioner crowd. Making fun of power is very different to making fun of those who are suffering.
Racism can also look like demonizing other people's religion or religious practices, calling any religion or practice different to yours a cult. It could look like dismissing people's cultural or ethnic heritage if they don't look like you expect them to. And it can also look like staying silent when others are doing wrong. So Elizabeth Leafault, who is the third in the best friends trio of Skeeter, Hilly, and Elizabeth.
They've been best friends since junior high.
And is May Mobley's mother, the neglected toddler we mentioned. She cares way too much about what others think of her, and she's really not willing to stand up for what's right. She listens to Hilly about everything and defers to Hilly and just does not have the spine to stand up for herself.
She may be less actively racist, but her actions still end up benefiting the cause of racism, even though she's somewhat less willing.
All in all, it's easy to read a book like The Help and think, I wouldn't be like Hilly, I'd be like Skeeter, while being blind to the way in which you're not being one of the good ones today.
And doing the right thing today, actually being one of the good ones, sometimes comes at an incredibly high price.
Skeeter paid an incredibly high price for her bravery. She lost her fiancé, all her friends, her entire community shunned her. Like, how many of us would actually follow through with that?
I have had times where I've looked back on things and wished I'd been braver and done more, rather than thinking, oh, someone else will do it. And in those cases, it's just been my own convenience on the line.
It's easy to look back on history and place yourself as the good guy. It's much harder to do it in our own lives here now.
Back to this friendship trio of Skeeter and Elizabeth and Hilly. It's quite interesting to observe the way in this book that friendships break and reform in different ways. Skeeter, Elizabeth, and Hilly were best friends since middle school.
Hilly's the queen bee.
She reminds me a lot of a couple girls I went to high school with.
And Elizabeth is desperate for Hilly's approval. Skeeter is really the only one who's strong enough to be herself and stand up for what she believes. She stands up to Hilly and she's willing to put her neck out on the line. And she's the only one there who seems to be bothered by the situation with the black maids, or the help as they're called. She's got a really kind heart, but at the same time, she's so clueless, and it's frustrating because she doesn't register how much danger she's putting the maids in at first. She starts off as someone simply trying to find a good story. Sure, she's sympathetic, but she also wants to impress the publishers. It's not really until she begins to hear the maids' stories that her eyes are opened.
And over time, she learns to see the issues within her own family and community that she just didn't see before, and that nobody else in the community sees. Everyone tells her, why would you want to change things? Things are fine around here.
Back to the power of storytelling. Knowing the facts like segregation exists, power imbalances exist, etc. doesn't change a viewpoint. It's people's personal experiences which can change your perspective.
And that's what happens with Skeeter as she engages with these stories and engages with empathy for these maids who she begins to see as friends. Things change, and she is no longer able to maintain close friendships with Hilly and Elizabeth, and over time, those friendships both fall apart. At the start of the book, despite disagreements over what I guess you could say are political issues, they remained friends. But there came a point where the differences became more than political, they became moral.
Skeeter realized that she actually couldn't be close to Hilly anymore because of their difference in morals and values.
It's crazy to me how high school friendships can take such a huge turn. Like, this is something I used to think about a lot in high school where, if you have a really small angle, like I'm a math person, right? If you have these two lines that are at like a 1 degree angle, over a short period of time, they're not going to get very far apart. But if you take that 1 degree of angle all the way out into outer space, you end up billions of miles apart. And I've always thought of friendships like that. In high school, you can have these tiny differences, but then as you grow up, those differences can lead you to end up in completely different places.
Yeah, and a similar thing happens with Skeeter and Hilly. Skeeter starts seeing Aibileen and the others as more than just maids, but as genuine human beings, which, obviously they are. And that changes the way that she sees her friends, who treat the maids as less valuable.
And I think that is actually valid. I hear people saying a lot, we can disagree on politics and still be friends. But I think that only extends to a point, like, what to do with taxes and tax money. And, some of those less moral things. I think when it comes to things like segregation or civil rights or human rights in general, it's not just politics anymore.
It becomes more about where it is you're willing to stand on the scale of right and wrong.
Skeeter lost Hilly as a friend, and in the process, her whole community, because they all followed Hilly's lead.
But she gained genuine friendships of Aibileen and Minnie.
And the book ends with Skeeter leaving Jackson, Mississippi for a job in New York and a chance to start over.
We haven't really touched on Minnie's relationship with Celia. It's quite interesting. It's one of the
three main relationships of the story.
Yeah. Celia's seen as white trash by the other girls. She comes from a place called Sugar Ditch,
which is a super, super poor but white community.
Like the poorest white community in Mississippi. And she actually married Hilly's old boyfriend and then moved to Jackson and stepped into an entirely new society.
This big fancy mansion, basically high society, which is not where she grew up. And as a result of her stepping into this life from her background, she is ostracized. All of the women in the town ostracize her and very deliberately, very cruelly exclude her.
And what's interesting is that she treats Minnie very differently from how the other white women treat the black maids. Celia hugs Minnie. She sits down with her at lunch. She treats her as a friend.
I think that this is something that can be described by the word intersectionality, where being beaten down by those above you forms this solidarity between different groups despite having different backgrounds because they're facing the same issue. Encountering Celia is the first time Minnie has been treated this way by a white woman, and it's quite confronting to her to think that all of these boundaries between black women and white women are just made up.
And Aibileen actually says something really important. She says, I used to believe in the lines. I don't anymore. They in our heads. People like Miss Hilly is always trying to make us believe they're there, but they ain't. Lines between black and white ain't there neither. Some folks just made those up long time ago, and that go for the white trash and the society ladies too. It takes Minnie a while to be able to warm up to Celia, as her experiences with white women in the past have not been good. But Minnie and Celia find that common ground of connection between race and class. They find that they can be there for each other and see each other as equals, or at least towards equals.
It's interesting how this solidarity connected Minnie and Celia. Minnie is black and Celia is white, possibly the biggest divide in Mississippi at the time. However, Celia came from extreme poverty into upper society, and she was an outcast. And she and Minnie could connect over that, and in doing so, they brought down the walls of black and white that were between them.
Because Celia was left out, she could empathise in a way that others would never be able to. And across all demographics, there are things that unite us, no matter how different we are. And I think that it's important to remember in a world that is clearly polarised along different lines, that those lines are created by us. And I just want to end with a quote, another quote from Aibileen. She says, all I'm saying is kindness don't have no boundaries.
And on that note, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of The Literary Lamppost. Join us on Instagram and share your thoughts with us. We'd love to hear what you think. Also, share this podcast with someone you think would enjoy it, and stay tuned for our next episode, in which we will be talking about The Handmaid's Tale.
We're going to be away for a few weeks, so it may be a little bit before that one comes out, but never fear, we shall return.
Make sure to follow us on Instagram and YouTube at The Literary Lamppost, as well as subscribing on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast platform to make sure you don't miss any of our new episodes.
Thanks for listening, and see you next time.
This podcast includes brief excerpts from literary works for the purpose of commentary, criticism, and analysis, which we believe constitutes fair use under copyright law. Our theme music was created by Joshua Ibbott for exclusive use by the Literary Lamppost podcast.
Mucho gusto.